was a Formula One driver, adored in Brazil, called Ayrton Senna, and he died in an F1 crash in 1993. And there was a quote of his that I misinterpreted for the vast majority of my life because from a young age, when I first time I watched the Senna documentary, I was just a fan. And one of his quotes was, "O faz uma coisa bem feita ou não faz." That's in Portuguese. Essentially, in England, it means you either do something well or you don't do it. And I understood this to mean that essentially, if you're not training to the standard of a world-class athlete, if you're not training to the absolute max you can do, to the point where at the end of the week you can barely walk down the stairs, this is the level of training that the best people do, and they sustain this, and it is realistic because I see these people doing this. That's how I interpreted it initially, but now I can look at faz uma coisa bem feita ou não faz. To me, either do something well or don't do it at all. That means that if you commit to something, you commit to doing your best, not necessarily doing what the best do. My best will be completely different, I imagine, or I know, to a world-class athlete who is genetically gifted. They have some very good doctors, nutritionists, strength coaches. Everything is kind of dialed into minute details. If I'm looking to just stick to that standard of what it means to train and compete, again, as a person who can't do that, especially at the moment, or if I wasn't someone who had trained for so long and just someone coming and starting their fitness journey, again, you're committing yourself to a standard that you're not going to be able to sustain. And I think a lot of people overpromise and underdeliver as opposed to underpromising and over-delivering, especially on social media. I don't want to speak too badly of it. A lot of sports psychology, a lot of this, you've got to manifest things and whatever. And I do believe in that to a certain extent. But what I also believe in is nothing is ever going to replace hard work and consistency. It doesn't matter what you say, it doesn't matter what you manifest, it doesn't matter how long you spend thinking about these things. Unless you do them, nothing's going to happen.
If you're scared of something like public speaking or going into a fight or attempting something that you've just not done before, a 1 rep max, that's all right. You should be scared. You've not done it before. But if you allow that fear to paralyze you, to not attempt the thing, then you'll never know what it feels like to do the thing. So actually the feeling of success, the feeling of joy, the feeling of satisfaction, completion that you'll get potentially, hopefully from doing the thing, only comes from doing the thing. You can only have that once you've done it. So be scared, do it scared, get it done. You don't start with somebody else's 1 rep max, you build up to your own. You can't have the things without doing the work. And as you say, just thinking, just dreaming, just looking in the mirror saying you're the best, if you don't have the evidence behind you, the months, potentially years of work, it doesn't mean anything.
I'm really glad you said that. That is my main critique of this sports psychology kind of fest thing, because I read a book a few years ago called The Psychology of Champions. I don't remember who the guy who wrote the book was. And essentially what he said was that, and he did a lot of interviews with a lot of athletes like Michael Jordan, Babe Ruth, and he spoke to them about different constituents to their training or mentality that led to them being the super athlete, if you like. And the thing that the main finding was that athletes who had performance goals did better than athletes who had achievement-based goals. So in other words, if I go into a competition and my goal is to perform at my absolute best, on the evidence he found was I'm going to perform better than if I went there just to win the gold medal. And I think as a result of having performance-based goals, so for example, in the analogy you use, that would be having the 1 rep max to hit. If the 1 rep max is my goal, I know that perform in said way to lift that 1 rep max, or if it's to go to a jiu-jitsu competition and perform in the way that I want to perform, I know the type of work and what level of work that I will have to commit to and do to achieve that. Now, when you do that and you come to the day where you're going to require courage, you're going to feel scared, the daunting experience is there, you now have that irrefutable evidence of all the training, all the hard work, all the dedication and diligence that you've put in to get to that moment. And my criticism of sports psychology or manifestation is, again, it's cautious of too much talking and not enough doing. And I don't believe that in the sense of sports psychology, I don't think that you can talk yourself into confidence. I think that confidence comes from irrefutable evidence of who you are and the training you've done and the preparation that you've made to get to that point. And the last thing I would say on that is, in terms of the courage on the other side of fear, is that a lot of people, they look at celebrities or athletes, or even in this day, like social media influencers, weightlifting influencers, they see them lifting these massive numbers or see them with these fantastic physiques. And then they look at their own training and their own life, and they're a little bit off put by that. But I think what people have got to remember is that courage wouldn't be courage in the absence of fear, right? If you had no fear, courage wouldn't be a thing. And tie this into too much to philosophy, but I think it's Aristotle's, is it theory of the golden mean, where every virtuous act is in the middle of the two extremes. So courage would be in the middle of cowardice on one side, and then on the other side, just stupidity, right? If I'm at war and I'm in behind the trenches and shooting at someone, if I just get up from my trench, run at the other side, and then get shot, I'm not courageous, I'm just stupid. But if I don't go to war, I'm not there on the day, or if I, for lack of a better term, chicken out, this can be with anything, with an event or whatever, that's cowardice. But if, in spite of the feeling that I feel, in spite of the fear, in spite of the anxiety, in spite of the knowledge that something could go wrong, if I do it anyway, well, then that's courage, right? And I think that a lot of people, they expect to do something courageous in the absence of fear, and it doesn't really work. You can't really have one without having the other, if that makes sense. And I think when we look back, and then you respect and revere people for acts of courage. I'm almost sure that every courageous act that's ever been done, especially when someone was in danger doing that, they will have felt fear. It's a completely natural kind of evolutionary instinct. And to go back to Choke, the film, I think Hickson at the end, who's the main character of it, Hickson Gracie, he says, intelligence and fear are very similar to me. If you say that you're not scared, you don't feel fear, you're not a very smart person. And everyone feels fear. Every fighter feels fear. Every boxer that you watch making the walk to the in front of 90,000 people at Wembley, if you think that they're not nervous and not scared, you're pretty crazy. Of course, there's going to be fear. Of course, there's going to be anxiety. Of course, there's going to be nerves. But the reason we respect these people so much and we look up to them is that in spite of the way they're feeling, they go and do it anyway. And I think that that's obviously something that we can apply to our own lives and know that just because you're scared, just because you don't want to do something, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do that thing. And a lot of virtuous acts and a lot of good things that are going to benefit you are on the other side of fear.
Huge. I think in terms of peak performance as well. So you need to be a little bit scared to be courageous. In order to perform at your best, you need to be a little bit anxious. You need to be a little bit stressed. I don't know if you come across the Yerkes-Dobson law. So it's like an inverted U. So basically, it's a way to think about how much anxiety is too much in the context of sport. And there's a peak amount of anxiety up here. And either side, if you're not a little bit anxious or you're too anxious, suboptimal performance lies, if that makes sense. So
Absolutely.
if you've got no anxiety, you're probably not going to perform at your best. There's not enough of a driver, a motivator for you to actually do the thing. If you're lining up a penalty kick thinking on the Lionesses and you don't actually care about it, probably not going to go in. You've got to have that amount of anxiety that means that your run-up has the right conviction, that you kick through the ball, that you put it where you mean to put it. And if you're too anxious, you're probably going to put it wide. You think so much on the technique that you forget about the goal. I'm not clued up on Aristotle, but if it's between two things, there needs to be an amount of it. There needs to be an amount of what we might see as negative in order to achieve the positive, whether that's anxiety, stress, doubt. It all comes together, it all plays a part. And if we think about flow states as well, it's that combination of enjoyment, capability, stress. I think it's 6 elements that attract, and you need all of it to be in flow and to perform at your best and to maybe not be conscious of even performing. So you've just mentioned Gracie and Jiu Jitsu. And when we think of what you practice, so BJJ, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, to somebody who's uninitiated, is that version of what I know to be a Japanese martial art the Gracie version? Is that what we mean when we think of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, or is Gracie a different take on it? How does that map out?
There's been a recent kind of surge in people looking back on the historical archives, actually what happened in the growth of martial arts in Brazil. There's so much information to go into, but to be as concise as I can, I think jiu-jitsu is a little bit misleading because it's more so judo that we come from. And essentially in Japan in the late 19th century, there was a guy called Jigoro Kano who was the founder of judo. And Kano had many students, and then what happened was you had the Russo-Japanese War, and there was a rubber boom in the north of Brazil. And so after the Russo-Japanese War, a lot of Japanese migrated to Brazil. Now this is the early 20th century, and when some of these Japanese judo fighters go over, they meet the Gracie family in the north of Brazil, in Belém do Pará. And Gracie's, there's the traditional story and then there's the true story, right? So there's folklore, there's the Chinese whisper story that's just been passed on through generations. And I grew up believing until I actually looked at the history of the subject. But what most people would say is that the Gracies learned judo. Carlos was good at judo. Elio, his younger brother, was very frail and physically deficient. And so he basically created a system where he could use the judo techniques in a way that could be used against larger opponents. And then nearly 100 years of evolution, you have UFC 1, where Royce Gracie goes in and beats everyone with Jiu-Jitsu. Jiu-Jitsu massively democratizes around the world, and now it's the sport. The true story really is that when the Brazilians learned judo, they knew that to compete with the Japanese, they'd have to create a niche and basically specialize in certain aspects of the sport because the Japanese were too good. So Jiu-Jitsu, it's grappling. You have the part of the where it's the takedown, so the throw or to take the person down the ground, and then you have the ground grappling. So basically, what the Gracies did was they specialized in ground fighting because they knew they'd have for two reasons. Number one, they thought it was more realistic for self-defense. In other words, a lot of fights in the street or self-defense situations, they end up being like a grappling and on the floor. And secondly, is they wanted to specialize in a part of the sport that they were better than the Japanese at. And that's a more historically accurate way of putting it. And then from there, Gracie and his brothers challenged many different martial arts fighters in Brazil at the time to promote and promulgate their art. This Then the Gracies start migrating to America. In this, Horion, one of the Gracie brothers, has the idea of the UFC. Now the UFC is this massive combat promotion, but initially the UFC was created to prove that Jiu-Jitsu was superior to other martial arts in a fight. The Jiu-Jitsu practitioner won UFC 1, 2, and 3, and so essentially proved what the Gracies were saying. And then Jiu-Jitsu from there went through a process of rapid evolution, and now it's been democratized around the world, and many different people do it.
Class. The opened choke is David and Goliath fight. I winced watching it. I think he's like a 6'4" Dutch bloke, weighs 250 pounds in against a Japanese shoot fighter. Now, I've not come across the term shoot fighter. And he was 5'6", I think weighed something like 150 pounds. I was thinking watching it, this is why we have weight classes. Now, this isn't going to go well. And it starts terribly on the surface for the shoot fighter. He's basically wrapped around the Dutchman's leg and the Dutchman's just stomping on his head. It's pure David Goliath stuff, a giant and somebody essentially throwing rocks at him. It's just like, how is this fair, right? This isn't going to go the way that we would like it to go for the little guy. And within about 4 minutes, the guy taps out. And what's happened? He's been put into an arm lock, I think it was in that fight, and he just can't take the pain. He's not experienced anything like that. And he's so small compared to everybody else, goes through to the final to fight Gracie. And the respect that those two have for each other is unreal. You have essentially the foreigner in the homeland getting the respect of indigenous fighter. And it's one of the best fights that I've seen. And the commitment from both guys, the respect, that it was just huge. And to actually see the craft and to understand how Jiu-Jitsu could work and how it can be applied. And it doesn't need to be bloody. It's about patience. It's about flowing.
I think there's a big cultural element to that small David Goliath paradigm and that was another way that the Gracies used to promote Jiu-Jitsu so well, because it came off the back of the Japanese-Russo War, where the Japanese weren't expected to fare as well as they did. And then you have this culture in Japan where they love this idea of the small man beating the bigger guy, and they really love that. And so I think when a lot of the Gracies went over to Japan to fight there, they were revered by the Japanese because they love this idea of the small intelligence can beat brute strength and the smaller guy can beat the bigger guy type of thing.
How did you get into Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, Lucas?
When I was younger, I started thinking, I was about 12, 13. And I started, for some reason, having this anxiety of, well, and not that a 12, 13-year-old should probably worry about getting attacked, but I just had this anxiety of, I'd like to know how to defend myself. I wasn't very physically strong, especially when I was at that age. And so I started looking at different martial arts to do and what to get myself into. So I'd just do my own research. And I came across UFC 1. And watching Hynes, all these massive, big, strong guys with jiu-jitsu just kind of left me in awe, really. And but at the same time, I would look at it and I would think, because everything I knew about combat sport or martial arts always involved striking. So I looked at it and I thought, well, grappling, is it really what I'm looking for? But I thought, I'm going to go and do it anyway. So in on my first day, I did a session. It was just a kid class when I was 13 years old, and I sparred with this boy. And I remember feeling his control. I don't know how to describe, but feeling how helpless I felt and how dominant he felt. Even at a young age, I came out and I was thinking, if I can get good at this thing, it's almost like a superpower. And it was for me straight away, I had this fascination with being able to completely control someone to the point where they can't do anything and you can do to them whatever you want. So from there, I was just absolutely enthralled in Jiu-Jitsu. I guess probably from our first session, I knew that this was it. And so that was how it came out of a desire to be able to defend myself. But from that, everything else happened.
A couple of things there. I want to talk about the everything else. Gracie, importantly, I think in the documentary, talks about it being a form of defense.
It doesn't, in the real world, it doesn't work out exactly as I'm going to say it here. If I strike a person much larger than me, the chance of me doing enough damage to end the fight is quite slim. But if a much larger person strikes me, the chances of ending the fight are quite high because they have such a physical advantage. And the idea is when we go start grappling, you have a situation where they don't have that kill shot anymore. And so physically, we're on a much more even playing field. Does that make sense? And so the route that the Gracies went down is they understood that the way they wanted to market themselves was they wanted to have an art that beat everything, regardless of what size the practitioner is. And they understood that in striking, if me and you stand in front of each other and the idea is you hit me, against a much physically larger person, that's not a good strategy. So it's almost it's a strategic way of fighting. And even more so than that, the idea is, and I'm glad that you touched on it, is less so about winning the fight and more so about not taking damage, so not losing. So Elio Gracie famously would say that if a draw, him being such a physically inferior person, was always a win. So he would have fights where some of them would last 4 hours, 5 hours. He famously had a fight against a guy called Valdemar Santana. I think it's the longest fight ever recorded. It was a 4 hour match. And Elio's mentality was, if I come out without receiving damage, I've won. And that really the idea behind Jiu-Jitsu and using Jiu-Jitsu as a vessel for self-defense.
Is it that sort of mentality where the role of player instead of fighter comes from?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that comes a lot from as well the fact that the idea of Jiu-Jitsu is the idea it's to beat another person with using the least physical attributes I can, doing the least damage that I can. And so the beauty of Jiu-Jitsu is if I use Jiu-Jitsu, we both go home safe, we both go home with no injuries. When you watch combat sports like boxing or mixed martial art, you see a lot of fighters, you're staring at each other. It's who's more man, who's meaner, who's more aggressive. And I'm not going to say that those things don't matter, but I think the avenue that we take in Jiu-Jitsu is to push those things to a side and say, no, our combat sport is about skill, efficiency, technique. We're not going to be bumping heads of each other, staring at each other, who's more man, who's bigger, who's stronger. It's more so I'm going to use as much technique, as much strategy as I can in order to do things. So it's essentially it's the victory of intelligence over brute strength and physical attributes. And I think that's where Jiu-Jitsu, we don't have the same culture. I think Jiu-Jitsu as an art in itself, I think the philosophy of the art is more, and it's a player, not a fighter. We're competing, not fighting. We're not looking to injure each other. We're looking to win through using intelligence, technique, skill, strategy. And that doesn't mean that again, and because I'm sure if people watch this, it's gonna be also you saying strength doesn't matter, physical attributes doesn't matter. No, physical attributes absolutely matter and they absolutely play a role, but we want to use almost as little physical attributes as we can in order to achieve our goal, if that makes sense. Whereas with other combat sports, particularly wrestling, judo, boxing, it's about striking hard, throwing hard, doing everything hard, everything's hard, fast, it's intense, it's using as much physicality as you can, using as much strength as you can, using as much aggression as you can, and almost more so leveraging these attributes in your favor. Whereas I'm not saying that you're not going to leverage physical attributes in jiu-jitsu, but the idea is to use it as little as we can, if that makes sense.
Makes a lot of sense. How much do you think this carries over, Lucas, to your general approach to life, your general philosophy?
I think to quote Hicks and Gracie, so I'm not going to be original with this isn't my own thing, but if you took jiu-jitsu away from me, it'd be like cutting off my legs. It's much more than a sport to me. It's a philosophy, it's a mentality, it's a paradigm. And I think the biggest thing there's many things, and I don't want to be cliche in this, but certainly one of the things that I've learned in jiu-jitsu and that I've applied to life is that when in a difficult situation, when in a challenging situation, when the cards are against you, the cards are stacked against you, or it looks like everything in life is going wrong. Into jiu-jitsu is the right answer isn't to freak out, to use all your physical strength, to panic. The right answer is to assess the situation and essentially seek the path that's most applicable. So in other words, if I find myself in a really bad spot in jiu-jitsu, if someone's in a much better position than I'm in, instead of thinking I'm going to use all my physical attributes to try and get out of this, then if I don't get out, I've exerted myself massively and my technique's going to be less sharp. As opposed to that, I'm going to be way more inclined to just assess the situation. What's the right response? What's the right answer? And look to that as opposed to panicking. And obviously, within panic, within stress, the right answer many times gets obscured and you end up doing things that wouldn't usually be you do, right? So I think a big that I've learned in jiu-jitsu that I think massively, greatly applies just to everyday life is that there's absolutely going to be times where things are stacked against you, the world's unfair, you've invested certain things and you haven't returned what you thought you were going to get for your investment and things are going wrong. Instead of pushing the panic buttons, instead of saying things you don't mean, instead of doing things that you don't really necessarily want to do, that are fueled through the stress and the anxiety of that situation, it's instead to stop, think, assess, and it's that thing of mindfulness, it's that pause in all the chaos. I think this is where Jiu-Jitsu massively helps people in life. And that's just one thing. There's other things as well, but I think the idea of calm and equanimity in really stressful situations is something that Jiu-Jitsu massively helps with. And also honesty and truth, because the work that you put into something, the investment that you place into something, it never lies. And you are going to return on what you invest. And it's if you can be dishonest, you can use the excuses in your head, you can tell yourself fake stories, but at the end of the day, when we both get on the mat and we start grappling, the truth's going to come out regardless. And so I think honesty and I think calm in stressful situations are two things that I've learned from jiu-jitsu.
It probably brings us neatly on to everything else that you've achieved with it. So you've always been humble, despite what I know you to have accomplished, and particularly still being as young as you are, or maybe in your head as old as you are. What have you been able to achieve with Jiu-Jitsu, Lucas?
I think what I've achieved in jiu-jitsu is I've found a sport or found a philosophy that also really accurately reflects other things that I espouse and value. And it's been something that, as I've just said, I've learned so many things that I apply in everyday life. I've met so many friends through jiu-jitsu, and now it's my life, right? So I teach jiu-jitsu full time. So that's my dream. That's what I've always wanted to do. And so I think my greatest achievement in jiu-jitsu, without a doubt, is being able to live my dream, being able to help other people. I know that's cliche, but just for lack of a better term, being able to see other people's progression and know that I'm a big part of that is definitely a massive achievement.
Which is huge. You're talking to a coach, so I wouldn't be embarrassed about enjoying the fact that you get to help people. In terms of what people can look to with you, though, the virtues that you've described, the way that you come across in person. I've always seen you as calm and reflective, and you take a breath before you take an action, which is massive. What level have you competed at, though? I think for people who aren't familiar with you, could you talk us through that?
As of now, I've only competed on the national circuit, but I've competed in pretty much the biggest competitions in England. So the English Open, I've won the London Open. On the national circuit, I've competed in the biggest competitions and won a few of them. But again, it's not. I look at competition more so as a vessel for self-improvement as opposed to just to go there to achieve the medal, right? And the medal is a byproduct of a good performance, and the medal is a byproduct of diligent hard work. But I think what you get from going to a competition, nerves from the day before, thinking, oh shit, tomorrow I'm going to be competing against someone who's going to try and break my arm or strangle me or whatever it may be. But then I always come back to is again, I reference my past. So before a competition, I usually get nervous the day before. And whenever I get nervous, I always think I've been through harder situations than this before. I've been through similar situations before, and it was okay. I survived. I'm here today. Everything's fine. And regardless what happens tomorrow, even if the worst case scenario happens, I'm going to be fine. I've been through this before. It's okay. And I think that when your confidence comes from irrefutable evidence and past experience, you're working on much more solid ground than someone whose confidence comes from telling themselves things that they don't even believe. And so, in terms of the national circuit, yeah, I've done a lot of the big competitions. I've had many fights and whatnot. But I think the biggest thing that I've learned through competing is overcoming fear, and it's the virtue of courage, right? Of going beyond that uncertainty, of going beyond that feeling of I don't really want to do this. I'd rather be home in a comfy bed. But understanding that on the other side of that is something that I desire and that I want to be there, and that the only person who's pushed me to be there or made me be there is myself. And something that I massively believe in is honesty. And if I'm dishonest, I could tell myself all the stories I want, but when I'm about to step onto the mat, if I know that I haven't done what I needed to do, I can't lie to myself, I can't lie to the other person. The other person's going to feel it as soon as the match starts. And so you have to be honest with yourself. You have to be, and it's not just being honest with others. I think it's being honest with yourself is much more difficult because you can tell yourself lies, you can excuse those lies, you can manipulate the world, you can warp the world to fit basically any bias that you want, but you're not being honest and you're not being true to yourself. And that it's going to show up at some point. The truth will always come out. That I think, and so I think in terms of competition, the greatest things that I've taken from competition, philosophies and experiences and things now that I can pass on to students and pass on. And so too with you, Jack. Obviously, you've got to the position you're in now through years of training, through years of research. You're obviously a very intelligent guy. You know what you're doing when it comes to what you do. I think that if you're telling yourself fake stories, if you're telling yourself lies, and if you're believing in them, I just don't think you're doing anyone justice, not least yourself.
Does it ever get lonely in your head having the sort of standards that you do for yourself, the kind of virtues of being a champion?
Absolutely, especially in the current world where we're inundated with Instagram posts or social media posts as to the way you should be behaving, the way you should be training, the way you should be eating, the way you should be doing this, the way you should be sleeping. A lot of times is that you're comparing yourself to other people and other people that are sometimes progressing in their careers or in their lives or on the social media accounts. Then you look at yourself and you think, I'm not in the position I wanted to be in at the moment. I'm not doing this that I wanted to do. I'm not doing that I wanted to do. But again, and I don't want to just keep on repeating cliches, but it's you versus you, and your standard of comparison has to always be yourself because you're constrained by so many different things that are not consistent with every person. Every person lives a completely different life. Everyone is shaped through completely different experiences, and so your standard has to be based on that. And I think the times that I feel down and lonely and find it difficult to espouse and be things that I'm saying, or are constantly comparing myself to other jiu-jitsu athletes on social media, the competitions they're doing, where they're at in their career, can be difficult at times, but I think it's just always important to remember that as long as you have this commitment to a version of yourself that you know is achievable. So I always pull this back to Nietzsche and his idea of the Ubermensch, right? The Superman. And what I infer from that is the Ubermensch or the Superman is the perfect version of yourself. So it's the perfect version of Jack. It's the perfect version of Lucas. It's the perfect version of, whoever. And you have this in your head and you're constantly striving towards that all the time, regardless of what your circumstance is. And I think as long as you have that guiding light in your direction to which you're going, I think that's half the battle there. And I admonish people to not compare themselves to what so and so's doing on Instagram or what so and so's doing on social media, because it is very easy, and it's also very easy to present or portray a version of your life that isn't really the truth on social media. So I think a lot of these people that look to as their inspirations or their standards for what they need to be doing, they're also not being completely honest with who they are or what they're doing.
I think a line that sticks with me is, would you do what they did to have or achieve what they have?
Absolutely.
And in the context of Tiger Woods, you had it also with Ryan Giggs. I had a signed Ryan Giggs shirt for a Champions League match. And when it came out about his extracurricular activities, Amelia tore it off the wall. I couldn't tell you where that once priceless piece of memorabilia is now, but that was pride and place. And then actually those characteristics, whether or not they were responsible for the performances that we praise Giggs for, they are a part of Giggs. They are a part of that legacy. And those characteristics and aspects aren't necessarily what you or I, and certainly not Amelia, would want to associate with. So you do sometimes have to question heroes, your idols. And I think that's part of the reason why some people would suggest that you never meet them, is because in person, they might not be who you thought they were.
I completely agree.
So something I've been thinking about, Lucas, is that you speak these two languages that I'm aware of. Do you feel that your ability to think in a different language, to be in a different language, and obviously you flow between these two, improves or informs your ability to flow on the mat?
That's a good question. Obviously, those two languages, English and Portuguese, I'm half Brazilian. I guess the answer is I'm not sure. But I would say definitely the cultural aspects of growing up in between England and Brazil have definitely shaped me. I would say it is in culture. I think that Brazilian culture has a really strong identity. I read a book a long time ago called How We Learn, and it was essentially the science of learning things and how to most efficiently learn a sport or a skill or whatnot. And a big thing was the more kind of ulterior knowledge and experience you have, the better informed you're going to be to make decisions based upon that. So potentially having the two languages, having the two cultures has maybe equipped me to better make decisions that are based upon those things.
When it comes to injuries and identity, you said that if jiu-jitsu was taken from you, it would drastically impact your sense of self. How do you manage those moments where you can't be at your best?
And it's a great question. And I think a lot of people, when an injury transpires or an illness or whatever that may be, kind of like a massive constraint on them physically, especially in the case of an injury. It's very easy to use the injury as an excuse and a lie for what you can and can't do from that moment on. So, for example, if I'm doing jiu-jitsu and I damage a ligament in my knee, so I damage a ligament in my knee, I probably know that for the foreseeable, leg jiu-jitsu training is going to be really difficult. And so I have to amend and adapt my standard of what it means to do your best to those constraints. So it'd be very easy for me to say, oh, I've got a damaged LCL or whatever it might be. Until that's healed, I'm going to eat what I want. I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to sit on the couch all day. I'm eating chocolate and whatnot, and just kind of wait it out. And then what tends to happen is you're 3, 4 months down the line, you look at yourself in the mirror, you don't see the same person anymore. You're 3 stone heavier. Your strength's not going to be the same. So if you were benching, I don't know, 70 kilos for 10 reps, you might now be able to do 55, 60. And so you're thinking, I'm not strong. I look worse. I don't feel as good. My motivation's gone because I was on a roll and I felt good and whatnot. And then the injury happened. Now, for me, that's a very dishonest way of looking at the situation, because there was things you could do when the injury happened that it's not going to be everything that the perfect version of you could do, but it's going to be way more than just sitting on a settee feeling sorry for yourself, right? So if I injured my knee, for example, my approach would be, look, it is what it is. It's happened to many people before. It will happen to many people in the future. I'm not unique. I'm not special. It's not the universe testing me. It's a freak accident. It's an injury. It's happened. What do I now do with what I have? You can continue to push your upper body strength. You can do mental work. I could watch more jiu-jitsu matches. I could read more books. I could learn more about strength and conditioning, injury rehabilitation. I might learn how to rehab my injury, which might lead to me rehabbing my injury. Now I have extra knowledge about rehabbing a knee injury that I didn't have prior to the injury. And I refer back to the fighter Ben Askren, and I urge anyone watching this, or you yourself, Jack, have a look at the guy's page, because what he's going through now is a really inspiring story. And he recently put on his Instagram video, and the video was called "Be Grateful for the Opportunity." And was essentially saying, look, I'm in the situation. He's there in a hospital bed with a lung transplant, stitches all across his torso, barely being able to speak. And he frames it as an opportunity to learn, as an opportunity to grow, and as an opportunity to overcome this hardship. And so if you injure yourself, if you get ill, and I know this is easier said than done because it's happened to me, and it is easier said than done. And I'm not going to lie. I'm never going to lie. I'm always going to be honest that there's been times where it's been really tough. There's been times that it's been worse than other times. And there's certainly been times that I wanted to throw the baby out with the bathwater or spill the coffee. But you've got to understand that you've got to make a commitment to doing your best and understand that that standard has changed. What am I going to do with that? Am I going to sit feeling sorry for myself, or am I going to be grateful for the opportunity and do what needs to be done? I think that's the paradigm shift that a lot of people have to make, in terms of, if they're not doing everything, they're not doing it at all. Or if they're not going 100 miles an hour into things, if they're not eating 1,500 calories a day, free, gluten-free, dairy-free, doing all the right exercise, doing all the right things, if one of those constituents changes, I can't do it anymore. Whereas, no, things are going to change, things happen. Your situation, as bad as it may be, I can guarantee you there's someone in the world living a much worse situation than you. You know, in the times we're in now, we're inundated with pictures of wars and whatever going on in the world. And you've got to understand that what these people are going through is far worse than a knee injury or a shoulder injury. And it's not a sufficient excuse for you to just languish and feel sorry for yourself and jump off the boat, so to speak.
I think that's massive advice. And it applies, I think, to injury, as you say, to illness, to people who are starting plans. Don't push it off till Monday. You can do bits now.
Yeah.
And all we ask is that you commit to doing little bits consistently. And the all or nothing bit, motivation will leave you at some point. You might not even be inspired to do anything. So the least you can do is just commit to maybe getting a good night's sleep, or just drinking enough water to keep your wee clear. Start with that to begin with, and then worry about everything else. Lucas, I feel like we could chat forever, and maybe an excuse to continue the conversation will be at the end of October, A24 have a new film coming out, The Smashing Machine, which takes the title from a Mark Kerr documentary, the 2000s, I think it was.
Classic documentary, yeah.
You know what happens in that. I don't. And I do know that The Rock has a no loss clause in his contracts. So far in his films, he's not had one where he could have been beaten up to a point.
Oh, really?
He doesn't want to be shown at any point to lose dominance. So I would love to chat to you in the light of that, having watched it. So if you're game for that, I'm going to catch you then.
100%. I've really enjoyed this, Jack. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the opportunity, like I said earlier.
No, I really appreciate you, Lucas. And I can't wait to chat to you again.